One of the first issues related to the digital space that caused significant public outcry and a political debate that can't really be considered settled even to this day, as far as I can remember, was the claim that violent video games cause real-life violence. More than 2 decades of research have disproven this assumption thoroughly, but as in the case of all the other partisan moralistic debates, there are some entirely unwilling and unable to accept that reality supersedes their intuition and the moral conviction. While intuition is empirically not a valid truth barometer anyhow, I might mention that it is not entirely counterintuitive to assume that virtual violence might reduce the conscious barrier of restraint regarding certain actions, since a desensitizing effect caused by constant exposure to a stimulus can be observed in the case of many cognitive activities, though this is true for the entire spectrum of emotions, ranging from fear to empathy, both in the virtual, as in the case of horror movies, as well as the real world, for example in the case of doctors or foreign aid workers. Naturally, individual people's reactions vary wildly. Some become indifferent, others break down and can't bear to continue witnessing something. The point is that not only is there nothing special about video games in particular, studies have shown that even though a momentary increase in aggressiveness may occur, even prolonged engagement in such activities does not noticeably alter someone's morality. That personality might be affected is plausible, but virtually unprovable. Furthermore, decreasing crime rates are often cited in objection to the initial claim. Like before, one might initially be skeptical of an assumed correlation. In fact, as it is even more difficult to also relate causation to correlation in these kinds of long-term observations, I'm not aware of studies providing any reliable results regarding whether or not an increase in the popularity of video games promotes a decrease in crime, or rather slows down a decrease that is happening naturally, for different reasons, over time. However, since only a small percentage of the population engages in violent crime, as opposed to a significant fraction who play violent video games, and the fact that the latter, which is typically associated with staying inside and forfeiting unrelated social activities, actually removes both other incentives as well as opportunities which might encourage someone to become violent, it seems reasonable to assume that video games do have a net positive impact on real crime. A similarly misguided debate has been occurring around the permissibility of fictional child pornography, lolicon. The legality issue is trivial. Child pornography is illegal because it facilitates harm to real children. Because this is obviously not the case with drawings, the argument for banning such shifts the burden on those viewing it. They are alleged to become psychologically aberrant, and then cause harm to children. Why this claim is unconvincing is illustrated by 2 states of affairs. Firstly, Japan, where lolicon originates and is legal, has lower child sexual abuse crime rates than many Western countries, including the US, which along with the UK ranks poorly in this regard by global comparison, and many European countries, thereby conveniently providing the largest possible scientific study. These crimes have significant dark figures, even more so in Japan, with estimates ranging from 2 to 3 times compared to the West, and laws may differ between countries to some degree. Though I am rather skeptical of the alleged 80-fold misalignment, probably at least partially resulting from an extremely wide definition of abuse by the WHO, who estimate 1 in 7 children experience abuse, but that's beside the point here. Even in the most pessimistic view, abuse rates are at most equal. Otherwise virtually every single Japanese child would have to be abused, which is absurd, which suggests the legality of lolicon. We are not talking about actual child pornography, which of course is illegal in Japan as well, is not a relevant factor when considering child abuse unless other factors are significantly reduced, which is unlikely. Unsurprisingly, there are, to my knowledge, no studies examining a potential positive effect, though one might argue that analogous to video games, the fictional outlet has a beneficial psychological effect. In any case, this suggested lack of correlation between cognitive activities and their influence on one's behavior indicates that no real-world normalization effect of violence is promoted. Rather, people are, as we should sure hope, in fact continually capable of separating real suffering from fiction and maintaining their moral integrity. Those who, on the other hand, are then willing to harm children, or others, anyway, are not doing so because they have been conditioned by consuming certain media. Crucially, I'd like to point out that this is not to argue that elsewhere people are never conditioned in such ways, but rather that, especially violent, behavior principally occurs in compliance with, or opposition towards, an ideology. Some may argue that, for example, shooter games glorify violence and thus constitute an ideology, but this is hard to maintain since there is hardly ever any more nuance than kill everyone, which is far too blunt to function as an agenda. Secondly, while sexual orientation is not entirely attributed to genetic factors and certainly not to a single gene, scientists generally agree that social factors' impact is minimal at most, and again, while the environment as a whole might have some effect, a single element like what kind of porn someone consumes certainly cannot be considered a deciding factor. Otherwise one would have to conclude that regular consumption of gay porn turns people gay, which is an outlandish claim hardly anyone, apart from some religious fundamentalists, would want to sustain. Consequently, child pornography, let alone entirely fictional drawings, can be assumed to induce pedophilia. That such works of fiction are banned in a number of Western countries and despised by a large portion of the population is, and this is implied by respective court rulings as well, based entirely on moral disgust and vague intuition, not scientific facts or ethical considerations. Even though I am furthermore of the opinion that freedom of expression surpasses other considerations in importance, it doesn't even need to be taken into account in this context. Then, of course, there's a long line of attempts to combat online piracy and regulate the distribution of intellectual property, most notably through bills PIPA, SOPA, ACTA, and currently Article 11 and 13. Taken at face value, any honest civilian should agree that original creators, copyright holders, being granted a share of the profits generated by a derivative work is only fair. That means that both authors and publishers, which authors choose to rely on for marketing and publicity, deserve a share of even reviews or parodies of a work, if the former could not exist without the latter, and is creating monetary revenue. Therefore, non-monetized transformative works cannot reasonably be taxed and should be legal to the extent to which they do not harm the original's profitability. Naturally, not all cases are obvious to decide, such as written fan fiction. In many cases it may be hard to argue that even though one piece of writing is based on or inspired by another, it could not exist by itself if one simply changed some names. On the other hand, in most cases, I would argue, the difficult part would be to decide on the exact royalty percentage. Ironically, what is typically considered most illegal, the unaltered redistribution of a work, would become more legal the more money someone made from it. That's rather unrealistic, of course, but it should be pointed out that even though people downloading things illegally typically pay very little, if anything, since that would defeat the purpose, there are at least some people involved in the process who are making significant amounts of money. This does not only concern full-length movies and the like, but notably also reaction videos, which are often little more than a full redistribution of something with sparse remarks. Either way, I do think it's sensible to require royalties for derivative or transformative works to some degree on top of the potential free advertisement for the original. To an extent it's also understandable that an author might want to reserve the right to bar anyone, or specific people, from modifying their works, but even regarding the generally legal exception of review, citation or parody, it cannot ultimately be deemed acceptable that copyright holders, or their publishers, abuse the instruments at their disposal to suppress unflattering or even insulting examination of their work, such as harsh criticism or ridicule. And of course there is no excuse for straight-up illegal takedown notices, which are becoming more and more common and are often upheld by the service providers, ultimately even backed up by the law. Crucially though, as probably everyone except politicians is well aware, not only does engagement with an original work generate free advertisement and thus additional revenue, Even pure copying does not damage profits anywhere near as much as is usually suggested, with the wildly incorrect assumption that every illegal download is a lost unit sale or video view. Next to the alleged and rather superficial goals given in favor of these laws, there is significant cause for concern about censorship in general, and more specifically the highly questionable encroachment of government interference in social matters, which really should not be constrained by ideology to ensure a stable and functioning society. And there can be no doubt that this power, once established, will be weaponized and abused in various ways that are entirely unrelated to copyright. The origin of the idea that publishers should receive royalties for as little as links to their content is the fact that they are paid for analog, that is print, media as well. And this, I think, is ultimately the main underlying misconception of the entire complex. Public advocates often say as much: since something is illegal in the physical world, such as theft, it should be illegal in the digital world as well, or at least be taxed. Superficially, this may sound reasonable, since it is not always immediately obvious what kind of adverse side effects laws can have. But the digital does not reflect the physical world. Shooting something in a video game is not like shooting in real life. Looking at images, drawn or otherwise, of naked children is not like abusing real children. Pirating a copy of a movie is not like stealing a physical disc, and insulting someone online is not like doing so in real life. The matter of hate speech might, while it is probably not as precarious a topic as the others, in some sense even be more dubious. But even though, again, I readily concede the potential of adverse psychological effects, consider the difference in impact the exact same insult or abuse is going to have when it occurs in the physical rather than the digital space. Neither do I doubt that somewhere, someone was inspired by a shooter game to murder someone, though I'd bet the same is true for a romance movie. And while I am not fond of using hypocrisy as an argument, it's prudent to point out that in the physical world there are many activities which are not just potentially, but inevitably dangerous. And while that can be tragic, I don't think that, for example, smoking or driving cars should be illegal, even though that would be perfectly sensible from a safety point of view. Rather, since obviously it is not only impossible to ban everything that's potentially harmful, but such efforts would themselves be harmful to society as a whole, the same train of thought should be applied to the digital space. Public policy needs to respect a reasonable trade-off between the ideal and the practical in both worlds to be able to achieve anything.